At 46 years old, Liza Mercer stood in the mud outside the only home she had shared with her late husband. One hand gripping the fingers of her orphaned niece, the other clutching a carpetbag that held everything she now owned in the world. It was her husband's own brother, Thaddeus Mercer, who put her out, waving a deed she had never seen before and swearing the house had always been his. When the county clerk would not meet her eyes, Liza understood that the law in that town belonged to whoever paid for it. She left with $9.40 to her name. 3 days later, at a tax auction nobody else wanted to attend, she spent every last coin of it on a forgotten, flood-cursed mining camp that had sat frozen and silent in the mountains for 80 years. Folks called it a fool's purchase, a widow's madness. They did not know that sealed behind its crumbling Assay office wall was a secret that would restore not only her fortune, but an entire town's forgotten hope. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Liza Mercer, if you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten too. Tell us in the comments. We would love to know where you're joining us from tonight. Liza had been born Liza Doyle in the spring of 1883 in a canvas and timber settlement called Pinion Wells, tucked into a fold of the Sierra foothills where the pines grew so thick the sun arrived late and left early. Her father, Nathaniel Doyle, was the camp assayer for the mining works up the ridge, a quiet, exacting man who could hold a fistful of crushed rock to his nose, rub it between calloused fingers, and tell you within a percent how much silver hid inside it. He raised Liza the way some fathers raise sons, teaching her to read the color of ore, the way other girls learned embroidery. "The world throws away more good than it keeps, Liza girl," he used to tell her, turning a dull gray stone over in his palm until a vein of brightness caught the lamplight. "Most folks only know how to judge a thing by what it looks like on the outside. You learn to look at what's underneath, and you'll never be poor in the ways that matter." She grew up believing him, and grew up, too, believing in the plain, unglamorous virtue of record keeping, for her father kept ledgers with the devotion other men reserved for scripture, insisting that a number written honestly today was a kindness done to someone not yet born. That devotion to plain honesty shaped her more than she knew. When she married Daniel Mercer at 22, a steady young timber surveyor with gentle eyes and an unfashionable habit of paying his debts early, her father told her she had chosen well, and for 18 years she believed that too. She and Daniel never had children of their own, though grief had a way of finding them anyway, first in the stillbirths, then in the long aching quiet of a house built for a family that never quite arrived. When Daniel's younger sister died of fever and left behind a 6-year-old girl named Sarah, Liza and Daniel did not hesitate. Sarah came to live with them, and for the first time, the house on Larkin Road filled with the sound of a child's feet on the stairs, and Liza discovered a fierce, unbargained for love that asked nothing in return, Daniel's older brother. Thaddeus had never approved of the marriage. He ran the town's grist mill and lumber concern with a cold efficiency that made him prosperous and largely friendless. And he had always regarded his brother's quiet contentment as a kind of failure, proof that Daniel lacked ambition. Thaddeus visited rarely, and when he did, he spoke to Liza the way a man speaks to hired help, correcting her opinions before she had finished stating them. Daniel bore his brother's coldness with a patience that frustrated Liza, though he only ever said, "He's the only family I've got left." "Liza, a man doesn't get to choose his blood." She loved him for saying it, even as some old instinct in her distrusted Thaddeus's silences, the careful way he counted things, the way his eyes lingered too long on the deed. Box and Daniel studied it. It was her father's teaching that stayed with her longest after he passed, that patience with small, overlooked things eventually pays a debt owed by the world, a debt most people are too impatient to wait for. She would need that patience more than she ever imagined, and sooner than she feared, for the quiet, ordinary happiness of the house on Larkin Road was closer to its ending than she knew. And the ledger her father left her, tucked at the bottom of a trunk, would matter far more than she could have guessed on the evening she first put it away. The fall came the way most true disasters do, not in a single blow, but in the slow accumulation of small cruelties that only later reveal themselves as one long betrayal. Daniel died in the autumn of 1927, thrown from his horse on a surveying trip through Copper Ridge, and Liza buried him beside her stillborn children in the little churchyard at the edge of town, believing, in her grief, that whatever else the world took from her, at least the house and the land beneath it were safe, deeded jointly in both their names since the year they married. She was wrong. Within 2 months, Thaddeus arrived at her door with a lawyer from the county seat and a document bearing a signature that was unmistakably not her husband's, though it took Liza far too long, in her sorrow, to notice the small telling waver in the pen strokes that Daniel's steady hand would never have produced. The county judge, a man beholden to Thaddeus for a decade of unpaid mill debts quietly forgiven, ruled the deed valid without troubling to examine it closely. Liza's protests were treated as a grieving widow's confusion. Neighbors who had known Daniel for 20 years looked away, rather than cross a man who controlled half the town's lumber and half its debts. She was given 11 days to vacate. She spent them writing to the state land office, to a lawyer in Sacramento who never answered her letters, to anyone she could think of who might recognize what had been done to her, and she came to understand, in those 11 days, the particular helplessness of a woman whose word is worth less than a forged signature, simply because of who holds the pen of power in a small town. Sarah, 12 years old by then, packed her few belongings without complaint, old enough to sense that complaining would only add weight to a burden her aunt already could barely carry. On the morning they left, Thaddeus stood on the porch that had once been Daniel's and did not offer so much as a wagon to carry their trunk. "You'll find charity somewhere, I expect," he said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. Liza said nothing. Her father had taught her that a dignified silence sometimes did more work than an accusation, and that the truth, patiently kept, tends to outlast the lies built to bury it. They took a room above the Mercantile for a week, paid for with the last of Daniel's small savings, until even that ran dry and the sympathetic shopkeeper could no longer offer credit. Liza sold her wedding china, her mother's shawl, and finally her father's old assayer's scale, though she could not bring herself to part with his ledger, wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her trunk, its purpose to her now nothing more than sentiment. By the time she and Sarah walked to the county courthouse steps that gray November morning, drawn by a notice posted for delinquent tax properties, Liza possessed $9.40, a niece who trusted her completely, and a grief so heavy it had begun, strangely, to feel like clarity. The auctioneer that day worked through a short list of forfeited parcels with the bored efficiency of a man who did not expect much bidding, and the last item on his list drew outright laughter from the handful of men gathered on the courthouse steps. "Larkspur Camp," he read aloud. 82 acres, mine works, assay office, and appurtenant structures, forfeited for unpaid taxes going back to 1849. A ripple of amusement passed through the crowd, for Larkspur Camp was known to every child in the county as the flood camp. The cursed diggings were a sudden cloudburst in the spring of 1849, had sent a wall of water down the ravine and drowned 12 miners in the lower shaft, including 2 sons of the camp's founder, a man named Josiah Pruitt. The camp had closed within the month, its buildings left standing exactly as they were, its ore carts still loaded, as though the whole settlement had simply held its breath 80 years ago and never quite managed to exhale. Nobody in Pinion Wells would set foot there after dark, and nobody at the auction bid a single dollar until the auctioneer, more out of procedure than hope, asked if anyone would take it for the minimum. ***. Liza raised her hand before she had fully decided to. Perhaps it was grief speaking, or her father's old voice reminding her that most people only judge a thing by its outside, or simply the desperate arithmetic of a woman with $9.40 and nothing left to lose. $9, she said, and the auctioneer, startled, brought down his gavel before anyone could think to raise it higher. The men on the courthouse steps laughed outright this time, one of them calling out that she'd bought herself a graveyard. And Liza, dry-eyed, only nodded and paid her $9, keeping the last 40 cents folded in her glove, and walked with Sarah the 11 miles up the ridge road to see what she had bought. What they found, as the light was failing, was a huddle of gray. Weathered buildings sunk into a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. A bunkhouse with its door hanging from one hinge. A rusted stamp mill choked with vines, and a squat stone assay office whose small window still held, astonishingly, 3 unbroken panes of glass. Sarah wanted to turn back before dark, and Liza nearly agreed, until she noticed that the assay office door, though swollen shut with 80 years of damp, bore in its old timber the same maker's mark she recognized from her father's own tools. It was, she realized with a strange lurch of feeling, the very building where Nathaniel Doyle had once worked as a young man, before he ever came to Pinion Wells, a fact he had mentioned only once, in passing, and which she had never thought to ask more about. They spent that first night in the bunkhouse, wrapped in what blankets they had, and in the gray hour before dawn, unable to sleep. Liza took a lantern and forced the swollen door of the assay office open, at last. Dust lay undisturbed on the counters, and a set of scales sat exactly as some long-dead assayer had left them, as if he had only stepped out for a moment 80 years before. It was while running her hand along the back wall, feeling for damp or rot, the way her father had taught her to test a structure's soundness, that her fingers found a loose brick, and behind it, wedged into a cavity clearly built for the purpose, a small iron strongbox, rusted nearly solid, its lock long since given way to time. Inside, wrapped in oilskin gone brittle but intact, she found a thick ledger, a hand-drawn map, and a letter whose ink had faded to the color of weak tea, but whose words, when she carried them to the window at first light, were still entirely legible. The letter was addressed, in a careful, formal hand, to whoever comes after us, and signed by Josiah Pruitt, dated the 14th of June, 1849, 11 days after the flood that had closed the camp forever. Liza read it twice before she trusted herself to believe it, and then a third time aloud to Sarah, her voice unsteady. Pruitt had written it in the raw days after burying his own 2 sons, along with 10 other men who worked the lower shaft. And in his grief he had done something few men in his position would have thought to do. He had set aside, in a covenant recorded in this very ledger and witnessed by the camp's assayer, a share of all future proceeds from the mine's upper vein, a rich, largely untouched seam his crew had only just begun to work before the flood struck, to be held in trust for the widows, orphans and families of every man lost that day, and for the support of the town of Pinion Wells itself, which had depended on the camp's payroll for its survival. He had never gotten the chance to act on it. Grief broken, he had sealed the covenant and the assay ledger together, along with a map marking a side drift where a season's worth of unassayed, high-grade ore had been stored safely above the flood line, untouched and unrecorded on any company book. And then he had walked away from Larkspur Camp and never returned, dying, the county records would later show, only 2 years afterward, alone, in a rented room in Sacramento. What struck Liza most, reading by lantern light with Sarah's head heavy against her shoulder, was a second-hand writing tucked into the ledger's final pages, notes on assay readings from that same untouched side drift, dated and initialed ND in a careful, exacting script she would have recognized anywhere in the world, for it was her own father's hand, decades younger, From the brief season he had worked at Larkspur before the flood sent him fleeing down the mountain to start his life over in Pinion Wells and never speak of the camp again. Her father, she understood now, sitting very still in the gray morning light, had been one of the few men to walk away from that ravine alive, and had carried its grief silently for the rest of his days, never telling her that the camp of his nightmares and the camp of her childhood stories were one and the same, and that somewhere in its ruin sat unfinished business he had never found the courage to return and complete. The ledger's figures, cross-checked against her father's own careful assay notes, told a story larger than grief alone. The side drift Pruitt had sealed contained ore samples testing at a richness that would have made Larkspur, in its day, one of the most productive claims in the territory. Samples that, if the vein held true underground, meant the upper shaft above the floodline had never been exhausted at all, merely abandoned in mourning. Liza sat with that knowledge for 3 days before she trusted it, walking the old workings with Sarah at her side, matching Pruitt's map to the collapsed and overgrown entrances, until she found, half buried under 80 years of pine duff, the sealed timber door to the upper drift, exactly where the map said it would be. She did not open it herself. Her father had taught her that the value of a discovery is only as good as the honesty with which it is verified, and she rode down to the county seat instead, ledger and letter wrapped carefully in oilcloth, to find a licensed assayer willing to examine the samples Pruitt had cached and confirm, properly and on the record, what she already suspected in her bones. Word travels fast in a small county, and it did not take long for Thaddeus Mercer to hear that his brother's widow, the same woman he had put out onto the road with $9 and a child in tow, had bought a cursed camp for a joke of a sum and was now riding into town with an assayer trailing behind her. He came to find her at the boarding house where she and Sarah had taken a room on the strength of a small advance from the assay office, and his manner for the first time in years was almost warm. He spoke of family obligation, of how a widow alone could hardly be expected to manage a mining claim, of how he would be only too glad to take the burden of Larkspur off her hands for a fair price. Fair, he was careful to say, being whatever figure would let her walk away without further hardship. Liza recognized the tone immediately. It was the same reasonable, patient voice he had used the day he stood on Daniel's porch and told her she'd find charity somewhere. She told him, gently and without heat, that Larkspur was not for sale, and watched something behind his eyes go cold and calculating in a way she remembered too well. Within a fortnight, Thaddeus had filed a claim of his own with the county recorder, asserting that a debt Daniel had supposedly owed him years before entitled him to a lien against any property his widow subsequently acquired, tax sale or no tax sale. It was a thin legal argument, built on paperwork nearly as suspect as the deed he had used to seize the Larkin roadhouse. But he had spent a decade cultivating the very judge who would hear it, and Liza understood that thin arguments, in the hands of powerful men, have a way of thickening as they go. Worse whispers had begun moving through Pinion Wells that the widow Mercer had gone half mad up at the flood camp, digging in ground where 12 men had died, disturbing a grief the whole town had spent 80 years trying to forget. Some called it disrespect. A delegation of townsfolk, more frightened than unkind, came to ask her to leave the dead in peace. Liza listened to all of it with the same patience her father had taught her, and then she asked the county recorder to schedule a public hearing, so that everyone, Thaddeus included, might see exactly what she had found, and exactly what Josiah Pruitt had intended 80 years before any of them were born. The hearing was held in the same courthouse where she had been evicted, in the same room where Thaddeus's forged deed had gone unquestioned. And this time Liza came prepared not with grief, but with evidence, laid out with the same exacting care her father had brought to every ledger he ever kept. She presented Pruitt's covenant first. its language plain and unambiguous. A share of the vein's proceeds bound in trust for the descendants of the 12 lost miners and for the town itself. Witnessed and dated in a hand that the county's own oldest clerk confirmed as authentic *. She presented her father's assay notes, cross-verified independently by the licensed assayer she had hired, proving the side drift ore was real and the vein above the floodline almost certainly intact. And when Thaddeus's lawyer rose to argue his lien against her, Liza produced one final document she had not shown anyone until that moment, a letter from Daniel's own old business partner in Sacramento, whom she had written to in her 11 desperate days on Larkin Road, confirming that Daniel had, in fact, paid off every debt he ever owed his brother a full 3 years before his death, and enclosing a receipt in Daniel's unmistakable hand, the same hand the forged deed had so poorly imitated. The judge, faced now with the whole county watching and a clerk taking careful notes for the record, could not so easily look away as he once had. Thaddeus's lien was dismissed within the hour, and the county attorney, sensing an opportunity to distance himself from a man suddenly exposed as a fraud, quietly opened an inquiry into the original Larkin Road deed as well. Liza did not ask for Thaddeus to be ruined, and in the end he was not. Though he was diminished in every way that mattered to a man like him, his mill contracts quietly withdrawn by partners, unwilling to be associated with a forger, his standing among the very townsfolk he had once looked down upon reduced to something close to pity. He returned the Larkin Roadhouse to her within the month, not from any change of heart, Liza suspected, but because the alternative was a public trial he could not survive. She did not gloat over it. Her father had told her once that justice, done quietly and without cruelty, tends to hold better than justice shouted from a rooftop, and she found, standing again on the porch of the house she had once believed lost forever, that he had been right. What mattered more to her, in any case, was Larkspur, and the promise sealed in Pruitt's covenant 80 years before. She organized the mine not as her own private fortune, but as Pruitt had intended it, a trust administered honestly, with shares set aside for the 12 grieving families whose descendants she spent the better part of a year tracking down. Some as far away as Ohio and Oregon, each of them stunned to learn that a grief their grandparents carried had, at last, found some measure of restitution. The town of Pinion Wells received its share as well, exactly as the covenant specified. And within 2 years the old schoolhouse had a new roof. The feed store reopened under new ownership, and a modest fund existed to help any family in the county who found themselves, as Liza once had, standing in the mud with nothing but a child's hand in theirs. She renamed the reopened works the Pruitt-Doyle mine, honoring both the man who had first meant to do right by his lost men and the father who had carried that unfinished grief quietly for the rest of his life. And she kept the old assay office exactly as it was, restored but unchanged. The same scales her father had once used set carefully back on the counter. A small plaque near the door bearing Pruitt's own words, "To whoever comes after us. We began this story by telling you that a woman named Liza Mercer, cast out with $9.40, spent every coin she had on a cursed and forgotten mining camp that the whole county had written off as worthless. We told you it seemed foolish, and it did, to everyone who could not see past the outside of a thing to what patiently waited beneath it. But Liza had spent her whole life being taught, first by a father who read stone for a living, and then by her own hard years of loss, that the world discards more good than it keeps, and that most people simply never learn to look twice. What Josiah Pruitt sealed away in his grief 80 years before, Liza Mercer finished in hers, not for her own enrichment, though she and Sarah never wanted for anything again, but because she understood, in her bones, that a debt patiently kept honest eventually finds its way to being paid, even across 80 years of silence. Even when the one who owes it has long since turned to dust. Thank you for spending this quiet evening with us. And with Liza Mercer, a woman the world once tried to write off as nothing. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it. And we'd love for you to leave it in the comments below. What is a time you found real value in something everyone else had written off as worthless? We read every one of them, and we treasure the stories you send back to us. Until next time, stay close, *.